Would you join me as we begin with a word of prayer? It's a privilege, Lord, to come back together again, to be in your presence, to be in the presence of one another, to have the opportunity to think about certainly our relationship with you, but also our relationships with others, those important people in our lives. This morning, as we continue this dialogue, this conversation together, might you enlighten us and transform us. Thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, good morning. It's good to see you again. Good to see you back here with us to take another swipe at talking about relationships. I always like to begin by doing a brief review of where we are. That way we have it all in mind together, and if there have been a few that have joined us that weren't with us before, they at least have a brief idea of what we've done. So what we're doing this week in the morning sessions is we are trying to construct a relationship model, a theological model based in Scripture, to help us be able to answer the question, what does it mean to be a Christian family? We're going to Scripture for our answer. We're trying to understand God's relationship with His family or His people. What are the theological concepts that govern that relationship? If we can understand that first, and if we can experience that secondly, then we can in turn come back to our own human families with a model in mind of how we are to live, with a direction to go, and with the empowerment of the Spirit to live in such fashion. So that's what we've been doing. You'll remember that we're building on two foundation stones. How God, in what? Still there in the Old Testament, treated His children. You all still out there? Israel, that's right. Secondly, how Christ in the New Testament treats His bride, the church. And what are the governing principles that we've drawn from Scripture? The ones Pastor Walter mentioned: covenant, grace, empowerment, and intimacy. Now, we started yesterday a conversation of why it is that sometimes things go wrong. Why don't they play themselves out in the fashion that they do with God and His people? First and briefest answer to that question is, well, there's sin in the world. As my son said so many years ago, that affects us. That's why he was pestering his sister. But there's a bigger answer than that as well, a more specific one maybe I should say, that we've been looking at, and that is the fact that sometimes we build relationships on the wrong foundation. Rather than building on covenant, which has its basis in unconditional love, we're building on contract, which has its foundation in performance. How well we perform. As important as that is in many contexts of life, when it comes to relationships of love, of affinity, of affection, a contractual basis will lead to trouble every time. So that's the basic gist of where we are at this point in time. Now, before we go further from contract, I remind you that we talked about not just the fact that contract as the fundamental reality of a relationship can be very, very negative, but actually as a part of relationships overall, it can be positive, because we have contracts in all kinds of ways with our family members. Now, before we move on from contract, I want to add one more piece to something I initially spoke about yesterday, and that is, if you're a single person, if you're interested in getting married, maybe you're in a relationship, or you have a child or grandchild who's in that condition, it might be worth thinking about this. I mentioned yesterday that of any time in your life to have a contractually based relationship, dating is that time, particularly in the earlier phases of dating. But as a couple moves toward marriage, if they want to move into covenantal terrain, they're going to have to make some changes, which if love is growing, love will help them make those changes rather naturally. Sometimes I'm asked, how is it that we can be reasonably sure, at least, that our marriage will be a healthy one and a happy one. In fact, a question that has been asked to me with some degree of passion, and I understand why, when I've done premarital counseling is, we love each other. We're happy with what we have. Our relationship is good. It's exciting. A lot of positive things happening. We look around us and we see so much negative in marriage. Maybe their own parents struggled or divorced. Maybe they have siblings or friends who have. We don't want to end up like that, they say. What can we do? What can we do to keep that from happening? Well, I would suggest two things at that point in time. The first thing I would say for the long haul is this. If you keep doing what you're doing now, you're more likely to keep getting what you're getting now. It's when people stop doing what they're doing now that they stop getting what they're getting now. So if you want to maintain the health and vitality and freshness of your relationship, then keep doing those same kinds of things that you do now. Things like small, nice acts of courtesy and kindness toward the other person, looking at them when they talk to you, enjoying their company, calling them when you're gone. All of those kinds of things that you do now will fairly easily begin to erode after marriage. If you want to keep what you have now, then keep doing what you're doing now. That's one way I would answer it. But here's the second, and the one that interests me now in our talk about contract. It is almost unavoidable that when people get married, they start to try to change the other person. In fact, people can end up feeling like I have become my spouse's home improvement project. They've kind of decided I need an extreme makeover, and they're going after it with vim and vigor and vitality. And that causes no end to conflict. Therefore, this is what I say to couples who are asking the question, not just how do we stay happy, but is this the person I want to marry? Is this the person I should marry? Is this the person who is wise for me to marry? I would ask this one question. It's a central key question in my opinion. And that question is, if nothing changes, if you're having the same challenges next year that you have today, if you're having the same arguments 5 years from now as you have today, if your spouse has the same attributes, the same relationships with their parents, the same relationship with you and the world, if all of that remains the same, it's still happening 10 years from now. If nothing changes, is that okay? Are you okay with that? In other words, if life is an endless stream of what you currently have, is that okay? Now, some people will say, oh, no. No. I love him. He's great, but he has got to cut the umbilical cord with his mother. I mean, she is, I can't handle it. Everything else is great, but that has got to change. I'll tell you, that's thin ice. That's very thin ice, because remember what I mentioned yesterday, marriage does not tend to minimize problems, it tends to magnify them. If you're concerned about his mother now, call me back in a year. You'll be talking then in very strong language about how you feel about his mother at that point in time. I am sometimes amazed at what people get into in their marriages, the difficulties, only to find out that those were present and evident and clear well before they got married. An extreme example of that is a man who is physically abusive. And then as you talk with the couple, you discover that he was that way before marriage. And somehow she thought, once we get married, it will get better. And it doesn't. It gets worse. Now, comfort yourself with this reality. No matter who it is you marry, there are going to be challenges. There's no question about that. Life is full of challenges if you're single. It'll be full of challenges if you're married. It'll be full of challenges if you live with immediate family, if you live with a roommate, if you live with a friend. Life has challenges. So marriage is going to have challenges. There's a book entitled The Lies We Believe, written by a psychologist named Chris Thurman. And in the chapter on marriage, he begins his chapter this way. He says, marriage is hard. Then he says, reread that sentence. Then he says, reread it out loud. Then he says, now tattoo it to your forehead and repeat it every day of your life. Marriage is hard. That's the reality. We cannot enter into it assuming it's going to be easy. Marriage takes work. A lot of work. I like the way a colleague and friend of mine says it. He says, when it comes to marriage, this is how you spell work. T-A-L-K. Talking. That's the work of marriage. If you can keep that going, your marriage will tend to do much better and probably thrive. So, ask yourself the question, if nothing changes, is that okay? Now, if you say, well, you know, I'm not wild about the way he chooses food, or I'm not wild about the way she keeps her house, you know, bedroom's kind of messy. You know, it's not a major issue, but I can handle it. I'm not wild about it. If it never changed, I could live with it. If that's your response, you're on pretty safe ground. But if your response is, no, this or that or the other, that must change. It's thin ice. I was eating Chinese food one time and broke open the fortune cookie, and it said, when skating on thin ice, your safety is in your speed. Well, that's true. If you're on thin ice before marriage and you're thinking that has to change, it's time to speed out of there because you're headed for trouble. That's the time to be contractual. That's the time to ask those questions. Is this working? Is there two-way, back and forth, give and take? Is this what a relationship ought to be? And if it is not, I am still at a place where I can end it. You all are familiar with Mark Twain, the famous American wit. Mark Twain said, when it comes to marriage, keep your eyes wide open before and half closed after. It's great wisdom. The problem is we tend to go through the courtship period with our eyes half closed, just kind of feeling our way because we're in a fog of romance and sexual chemistry and attraction. It's not a bad thing, but it is an insufficient way to establish a sound foundation for a long-term relationship. And then we get married and somehow all the blinders come off and suddenly we look at that person with absolute clarity, not through a glass darkly, but face to face, to use Paul's words. And sometimes we say, whoa, I'm not so wild about what I see. So I'm going to set about to change them, to remake them in my image. Now let me give you some news that may not be news to you. It was news to me when I got married and in the years thereafter. Maybe it's not news to you. Maybe it's good news, maybe it's bad news. I don't know. You'll have to decide. But here's the reality. The innate person who I am, the innate person who you are, meaning your temperament, who you are, is unlikely to change very much at all over the course of your life. That innate core person who you are. Your now people will take different temperament sorters. Maybe they'll do Myers-Briggs or Kiersey Bates, and they'll come out with their they're an ISFJ or EFNP, or ESTJ, or whatever the case might be. Or maybe they take the one where the answer is you're melancholy, phlegmatic, sanguine, or choleric. People do those temperaments. That's what I'm talking about. That core temperament, who you are, is unlikely to change a great deal over the course of your entire life. Now that's an important understanding to have. Because if you enter into marriage trying to remake your spouse in your own image, you're going to have trouble. Here's the way I would say it. What are the popular cars here in Australia? Ford? Alden? Toyota? Do you have Lexus? Yeah, Lexus? All right, let me use that as an illustration. Let's say you say, before marriage, in terms of your relationship, I want to drive a Lexus, then if that's what you want to do, you'd better shop at the Lexus dealership. Don't shop at the Toyota dealership. Because what you're going to do is you're going to end up buying a Toyota. You're going to drive it off the lot, and you're going to spend the next 5 years trying to hammer it into a Lexus. At the end of 5 years, it's still not a Lexus. It's never going to be a Lexus because it never was a Lexus. But what you will have now is a beat-up Toyota. If you want a Lexus, shop at the Lexus dealership. In other words, let me make this real practical. If you want to marry a person of faith, date people of faith. If you want to marry an Adventist, date Adventists. If you say, I will never be married to a physician, my father was a physician, he was gone all the time, I don't want that kind of life, then don't date physicians. In other words, date who you're prepared to marry. And then there will be less of a temptation to try to change them after the marriage. It's in that period of time that contractual thinking can be a positive reality. Thinking through those implications. I find interestingly that a lot of people don't think those things through. I look back to when Anita and I got married. I am amazed at how naive we were. Amazed. Back in that time, it's been a few years ago, back in that time, we didn't do any premarital counseling. Any. I'm stunned by that now in today's world. Now, I don't marry couples unless I do premarital counseling with them. But you know what happened? In our early marriage, we had so much conflict that we ended up in counseling before we had been married a year. That started a journey for us, and in particular for me, that was life-changing. I ended up after that taking a degree in it, getting licensed in it. It's become a study of my life, for which I'm profoundly thankful to God. But I look back and say, how naive we were. How many things we never even thought about. And I find that in couples in today's life and world and couples that I counsel. I will have couples sit in front of me and I will start asking them specific questions. And sometimes I almost get the feeling that they're thinking, when can we get past this kind of stuff and get to the real meat? I'm asking them questions like this. So who's going to handle the money, the checkbook? I don't know, we'll work that out on the way. Really? Okay. Who's going to do the cooking? I don't know, she will, I guess. What? Who's going to clean the house? Well, I'm not going to pick up after him. Well, hey, that's the way I am. Who's going to? And they think, well, those are just the details. We'll handle that on the way. When do we get to the big stuff? And I'm tempted at that point in time to say to them, go get married, live together 3 months, and come back and you tell me what's the big stuff. Because by then they're fighting over the checkbook. She says, I will not pick up another sock for him. And he's saying, where's my dinner? And she's angry. Because all of that little stuff, they haven't really talked about yet. In fact, if you are dating and you're intending on marrying someone, I know it's a great experience to go out and have a wonderful evening at the symphony and go to a fine restaurant and dine well and all. All those things are good. I'm not against those kinds of things. But if you really want to know the person you're going to marry, date like you live. Invite them to come over next Sunday and help you clean out the garage. See what they do. Go with their family. Go with your family on a camping trip. And let everything fall apart when it rains. See how they handle it. Do things together that you're actually going to do together in real life. That's a way you truly get to know someone. That's a way you come to understand not only who they are, but you come to understand who you are. There's one wit back in the U.S. who said it this way. When you get married, there are actually 6 people that get married. And in the first year, 4 of them die off. So who are those? He said, well, the first 2 to go are the guy you thought he was and the gal, she thought you were. Those 2 go pretty quickly, what you thought each other was. The next 2 to go are the guy you thought you were and the gal you thought she was, as you find yourself doing things you said you'd never do in marriage. The last 2, and these are the 2 that remain, are the guy you are and the gal you are. That's where you decide if you're going to make a marriage. the true, real people. So, contract in dating can be positive. Is this what I want for marriage? If not, I need to end it. Now, I said something a moment ago that I want to just clear up quickly, and then we'll move on with the model. And that is this. I said people don't change much. That is true. However, we can learn to adapt. Let me give you an example. My wife and I, in terms of being introvert or extrovert, are on opposite ends of the pole. I'm an introvert. She's an extrovert. Now, people who know me in public life have a difficult time at times believing I'm an introvert because my life is people and talking. The very thing you say an introvert doesn't want to do. I have adapted. I have learned to do that, and I can do it well to a certain point and a certain degree. At times, people come over to the house to eat, and Anita will tell me later, that so-and-so came in the kitchen and said, "What's wrong with Randy?" And she says, "What do you mean, what's wrong with Randy?" "He's not saying anything." She says, "That is Randy." "What do you mean, what's wrong with him?" "That is who he is." I'm an introvert. Now, here's one of the ways you can tell the difference between introvert and, in fact, two ways you can tell the difference between introvert and extrovert. An extrovert and an introvert can be defined by what people do to you. For an extrovert, people energize them. If you're an extrovert, people energize you. My son Austin is an extrovert. I don't know that he's spent more than 10 minutes in the room the whole time we've been here except for sleeping. He's out meeting, talking, going, seeing. I've spent most of the time in the room since we've been here because I'm working on things for home and I live in my head. People energize extroverts. However, with introverts, people deplete you. You can be around them, but they deplete you. So a key question to ask is, when you get tired, how do you recharge your batteries? How do you rejuvenate, refresh yourself? For an extrovert, they'll have people over. They'll go over to a friend's house. They'll have a bunch of people. Bring them over. Let's have a party. We have a weekend off. Great. We can have people over. For an introvert, it's, oh, no, please. Please, let's don't do that. Please, I want to be alone. I want to think. I want to recharge. That's a very big difference between those two. Because of that, I will often ask couples who are on their way to marriage, how do you rejuvenate? How do you spend holiday time? How do you spend time off? Because that can be a source of great conflict if you don't find ways to manage it well, because it's very common for opposites to attract. So early in our marriage, we go on holiday, we go on vacation, we go to Hawaii, and I think Hawaii, beautiful. Great white sand beaches, great pool, lounge chairs. You can sit out at the beach and you can read and just relax and enjoy the vacation. My wife says, Hawaii, great. Mount Haleakala's there. We can climb up to the crater. We can ride bikes all the way down to the bottom. We can go tube surfing. We can go surfing. We can go, and I'm saying, wait. This is vacation. She says, I know, isn't it great? We can do all, and you know what? There's several people from our church going, and I'm, oh no, please don't do this to me. No. That's the worst news I've heard all week. Difference. Now, almost 30 years later, we have learned, we have adapted, and now when we go on vacation, that issue which caused conflict early in our marriage is seldom a source, not never, but seldom a source of conflict. I've adapted, she's adapted. The interesting thing is now, I am much more prone to be willing to go and do and see. Much more willing. She is much more prone to say, I'd like some time, some downtime, when we can just read, enjoy each other, not be stressed out. Because by the grace of God, there has been an adaptation that happens. Understanding that going in would have been very helpful to us. We didn't understand that at the time. Very helpful. Now, having said the fact that we have learned all of that, do you know what else is true? If you hit the reset button in the computer of my life, reset, restore all the defaults that were true at the beginning, I will go right back to who I am. solitary, alone. I don't need to go do. I don't need to see people. Because that's who I am. I've learned to adapt, but that's the core of who I am. Same with her. Hit that reset button. She'll go back to who she was. That's an important reality to understand going into marriage. A second way to know about extroversion and introversion is to ask, where do you process your information? An extrovert processes his or her information out here. They talk about it. As they talk about it, they come to understand how they feel about it. That's how they make decisions. So you run into an extrovert, and she says, oh, it's great to see you. Man, I'm having to decide where I'm going to go work next. They've offered me a job here. They've offered me a job there. For 30 minutes, you're there with this person. About 28 and a half of which she spends talking. About a minute and a half of which you say, so what are you going to, and then off she goes again. Off she goes again. 30 minutes later, she hugs you and she says, you have helped me so much. Thank you so much. And then she goes walking off, and you stand there looking at her thinking, you know what? Either she's a very good liar, or I am totally out of the loop on what it means to help someone. The reality is you probably have helped her enormously because of the simple reality that extroverts process information out here. They process it by talking about it. And your listening ear, to allow her to talk, has helped her understand what she thinks and what she needs to do. So you have helped her. However, an introvert processes its information right in here. They don't have to talk about it to know how they feel about it. They have to think about it to know how they feel about it. They have to think about it to decide what they were going to say about it. And so when an introvert is facing stress or important decisions, he or she will tend to get alone, take long walks, sit out by the pool. Some go out and exercise, some go out and work, but all this time they're processing this in here. Meantime, the extrovert is saying, what do you think? What do you think? Well, I don't know. What? I don't know. You know, what are you thinking about? Stuff. What do you mean stuff? What are you thinking about? They're not ready yet to talk about it. Once they've sorted that through, once they've formulated it, then you'll get something. But even then, it may not be a whole lot. But you'll get something. Now just consider those two realities and how much those can set us up for conflict in marriage unless we understand them. Once we understand, then we can make a decision. Am I ready to accept that? Can I live with that throughout my life? If so, then it'll be good. A very important reality. But again, it comes back to this issue of contract. Am I willing to accept that? Is this the way it is? If this is the way it's going to be and I'm okay with that, then let's move ahead. If this is the way it's going to be and I'm not okay with that, then we need to rethink the reality of the relationship. Okay, now, let's go back to our model. Contract, based on performance. Remember what we said yesterday. With contract, the same thing will be true that was true with covenant, and that is that something will go wrong. In reality, a lot of things will go wrong, but at least something will go wrong. With covenant, when something goes wrong, you get grace. With contract, since that is a legal concept, with contract, when something goes wrong, you get law. You get law. And when law is broken, punishment follows. With covenant, when disappointment comes, grace follows, and grace is the soil in which forgiveness grows. With contract, law is violated, and punishment follows. Some kind of punishment gets meted out. Now, sometimes punishment is legitimate, as in the disciplining of a child. It's necessary, it's important. Trying to sort through what is healthy punishment, however, from what is vindictive punishment is truly important for a parent. What our children should never question is our love, our commitment to them, their belonging, the fact that they are valued in our sight. That should never be up for question. In whatever kind of punishment we have to dole out, the relationship should not be threatened. However, punishment to be effective does need to, in some way, and I'm going to put this in quotation marks, hurt. I put it in quotation marks. It should never harm. There's a very big difference between those two words, hurt and harm. Should never harm. But it does need to hurt. Now, what do I mean by hurt? Well, take a 12-year-old boy, and you say to him, give me your phone. You've lost phone privileges for the next 3 days. You think that hurts? Like nothing else. That is the most painful thing they can imagine. Or to the 15-year-old girl, okay, you're going to be grounded for the next 4 days because you violated what we agreed would happen. But Mom, this weekend is when I know. Well, you can't do that. I know. It hurts, doesn't it? Remember, that's the empathy. But the reality is, this happened. That's what I mean when I say hurt. Now, sometimes people ask about spanking. I have no idea what the laws are in Australia about spanking. The laws in the United States have become increasingly more stringent, and that is a good thing in the protection of children. However, if you are a parent who spanks, which is still an option many parents use, I would strongly encourage it to be nothing more than the hand and nowhere but the bottom. And once or twice, and that's it, and for severe acts. I grew up in a world in the southern part of Texas where, let me tell you, when they spanked you, you knew it. It wasn't with a hand, it was with something else, and it was 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever it took. That was the world, and that's been the world there for probably generations back. I don't know what it is in Australia. It's a different world now, but still there is necessity for legitimate kinds of discipline, legitimate kinds of punishment. In fact, ask yourself this question. When was the last time I was around a family with children, whose parents never spoke this word to their kids? No. When was the last time I was around a family whose parents just let them do anything? And then ask yourself this question. How much did I enjoy that? How eager am I to be around that family again? In fact, an important question we learned as our kids were growing up was not, do you enjoy being around your children? The question was, do other people enjoy being around your children? That's probably an indication of how well the parenting is going. In other words, children need to learn the meaning of no. Must learn that if they're going to adapt well to life. But they need to learn that in the context of relational yes. Yes, you're our child. Yes, we love you. Yes, we care about what's important to you. Yes, we want you to be able to enjoy life. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, as many times as possible. But there need to be also clear and firm no's. Does that make sense? In fact, I would add this to it. If you're a parent of young children, here's an important lesson we tried to learn. I hope we learned it. We certainly tried to. The lesson of parenting for tomorrow. Parenting for tomorrow. Because it is very easy as a parent of young children to just parent for today, parent for this moment. In other words, we got to survive this trip to the grocery store. We got to get out of there before they kick us out of there. We just got to get through it. And so when you're standing at the checkout counter and there's the candy there, I want candy. No, we're not buying. I want candy. No, we're not. I want, and we're creating this huge scene. It's fine. Okay, just take some, shut the child up. That's parenting for this moment. And I know what that's like. I've been a parent. You're just trying to survive and get through this church service or whatever the case might be. That will come back to haunt you. Will come back to haunt me, any parent. Parent for tomorrow. In other words, parent by asking yourself the question, if this is what I do now to deal with this situation, what is the implication going to be for tomorrow? What fruit will I harvest tomorrow because of this decision today? My wife used to say that to me, particularly with our daughter. They say she's a daddy's girl, but, come on. Cut me some slack. But anyway, she used to say, when I would say yes, Miranda would ask me and I'd say yes, I'd see my wife behind her looking at me like, And when Miranda would leave, she'd say, so what are you going to do when she's a teenager? I'm like, I'll deal with that when the time comes. She's like, I want to see that. You know, and then at times when I would do that, she would say to me two words that strike terror to my heart. She would just look at me and she'd say, "Go ahead." I'm like, "What do you mean, go ahead?" "Go ahead. That's what you want to do? Go ahead." That is not permission. That is a dare. You know? Go ahead. And I began to learn about parenting for tomorrow, so that whatever discipline, whatever punishment needs to take place now keeps in view the long haul. What implication does this have for tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, for their teenage years, and for their life? So, punishment sometimes is legitimate. However, contractually based relationships use punishment in other ways. We find ways to punish each other that are very hurtful and can harm our relationship. For example, think of some ways that we punish each other in a marriage. A spouse does something you don't like, you just shut down, stop talking to them. I remember a couple that I knew where he would stop talking for days at a time. 3, 4, 5, 6, a week. She was climbing the walls, going crazy. Didn't even know for sure what she had done wrong. Trying to figure out, talk to me. Silence. It was a terrible emotional punishment. Sometimes we emotionally punish each other by the opposite of that. Getting loud and angry, getting abusive, calling people names. That's a terrible emotional punishment. Sometimes we punish by getting more controlling with the checkbook, with the money. Tightening the purse strings, one of you only trying to control it. Sometimes we punish each other by withholding sex, withholding physical affection. All of those kinds and many others can be forms of emotional punishment. You didn't fulfill our quote-unquote contract, the bargain that I thought we were working under when we got married. And so I'm not going to talk to you until you do what I want you to do. I'm not going to be sexually available to you until you do what I want you to do. This will play into the next part of the model. But emotional punishment can be very damaging in relationships. The longer in which we practice those kinds of punishments, the more emotional residue builds up. And therefore, the more stopped up, the more clogged up the passageways of our lives can become. It's much like a drain in the bathroom shower or in the kitchen sink that just builds up residue and starts getting clogged up. The water can't drain, it can't move through freely as it ought to. That kind of emotional residue builds up in a relationship, and it becomes very difficult at times even to deal with the simple realities. Because there's been so much emotional punishing that goes on that issues have never been dealt with. There's a gentleman in the United States, a researcher by the name of John Gottman, who's done research now for 3 or 4 decades on what makes marriage work, what causes marital breakdown. Another research team at University of Denver with Howard Markman and Scott Stanley doing very similar research. One of the interesting things these teams of researchers have found is this. They can give an instrument to couples who are engaged, not even married yet, and based on the results of the instrument, can predict with right around 90% accuracy whether or not that couple will still be married 15 years from now. The basis on which they make that assessment is how they manage conflict and how well they repair after conflict. In fact, Gottman says the ability to repair is maybe the most crucial thing a couple has. What does he mean by that? It means when we've had a disagreement, when we've had an argument, when there's been a fight that has unfolded, can we say at the end of it, I am sorry. I am sorry for what I said. I'm sorry for how I mishandled this. I know I hurt you and I apologize. And then follow that up by saying, you are forgiven. Can we physically embrace? Can we repair any damage that was done? It is an unrealistic goal for a marriage to say we're not going to have conflict. If you're alive and you have two thinking people, you're going to have conflict of some kind. Some will have it much more, some will have it less, but you're going to have it. The question becomes, can we repair? For people who emotionally punish each other, that repair work is very hard. Because they're too hurt, they're too proud, they're too angry, there's too much buildup over the years, and they have a difficult time bringing that to a place of true reconciliation, which is the goal of all Christian forgiveness, is reconciliation. So, contractual relationship, that's the foundation. Contract gets disappointed, law is broken, punishment follows. However, we want to change things. I use the illustration of renting an apartment, a flat, a house. If you have a relationship like that, a professional contract that is not working out, someone stopped paying the rent and you've got to get them out. The truth is, at least in America, I don't know how it is here, it is easier if you can get them to start paying again than it is to go through the legal process of eviction. It's expensive, it's lengthy, it's emotionally draining, it's a tough reality. So it's easier to get them to go back and honor the contract, even if maybe you have to forgive a month or two of rent, just to get them to honor that and let's move forward together. Same thing is true relationally. For most people, when the contract gets violated, for most, not all, but for most, the desire is, well, let's get it back to the way it's supposed to be. Or back the way we thought it was going to be, or back to the way we planned that it was going to be. But that means that there has to be change. Change. Now, a lot of people in contractual relationships seek change in a misguided fashion. Let's go back to our model here. It's interesting that in our model, down here at the bottom, is empowerment. The goal of empowerment is change, right? When you empower someone, you're empowering them to do something they otherwise could not have done. They're changing from what they were. So in covenantal relationships, we seek change. But the method by which we accomplish that is empowerment. In contractual relationships, we seek change. But the method by which we accomplish that is much more often a method that might be called manipulation. Manipulation, coercion, force, those kinds of things to make somebody change. It's about as far as you can get from empowerment. In fact, think about this. The word empowerment, the word right at the core of that is the word power. A very common sociological definition of power is that power is the ability to influence another person. When you have the ability to influence a lot of other people, you're a very powerful person. If the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Australia walked in and stood up here right now, we would all pay attention. We'd probably stand up. We wouldn't know what to do. Do we salute? What do we do? You know, because here's a person of power. They would influence how we behave. That's power. Power is not necessarily good. It's not necessarily bad. It just is. We can use it in very positive ways or use it in very damaging ways. I don't know if you've heard of the U.S. president from years ago, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Heard much about his life. LBJ was a tall, big Texan who was very uncouth, who had a lot of power, and who used his size and power to manipulate people. I read one of his cabinet members describe an incident he had with LBJ at the ranch LBJ had in Texas. He said, we were out at the Texas ranch. We were out in the pool swimming. And the president came over to me and he said, I don't remember what the cabinet member's name was, but say his name was John. He said, John, I'm going to start this new program and I want you to be in charge of it. Now, John didn't want to be in charge of it. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. But how do you say no to the president? And so he's trying to be very, very gracious and respectful. Oh, Mr. President, thank you so much. I appreciate the confidence you place in me, but really, I have a lot of things on my plate. I think there are people who are much more gifted. Nope, I want you to be in charge of this. And he said, we went back and forth in this, back and forth, and I'm trying this dance to try to figure out how to say no so that he'll accept it. He's just charging on. We're going through this, he says, when I suddenly realized, man, if I don't get out of this pool, I'm going to drown. He says, I'm out here treading water. You know what? I'm getting more and more tired. He's wearing me down. I'm getting more and more tired. He said, it finally came to the point where I thought, I either say yes and get out of this pool or I'm going under. And so finally he said, out of desperation, I said, okay, Mr. President, well, I'll be happy to lead that. He said, as soon as I said yes, we got out of the pool. It wasn't till then, he said, that I realized what had happened. He had positioned me in a part of the pool where the floor slanted down. He was standing on solid ground and had me treading water. And he just kept after me until it was either yes or drown. And that's when I said yes. I don't know what you call that. I call that manipulation. We manipulate in many ways in human relationships. We can manipulate as parents with a mere look, with a word, with a withdrawal of affection, with silence, with belittling. We can manipulate. And a lot of times we'll get kids to do what we want them to do. Is that beneficial to them in the long haul? No. I don't have, by any stretch, the corner on parenting. I feel so much like, I read about this guy. He offered this seminar called 10 Commandments for Good Parenting. And then he had kids, and he changed it to 5 suggestions for good parenting. And then his oldest kid turned 2 years old, and he changed the title to 3 Helpful Hints to Survive Parenting. And then his kids became teenagers, and he quit offering the seminar altogether. So I feel that way sometimes. But there is one thing that we tried, Anita and I tried to do. Don't know how well we did it, but we honestly from the heart tried to do it. And that is, the older our kids got, the more freedoms we gave them. And we would say that, you know, Dad, we want to go do this or that or the other. Okay, well, who are you going with, and how long you think it'll be, and so forth. Is that a wise decision? Things good? You know, we'd kind of sort that out. We let them go. I don't think my son is here anywhere, but I'll tell you this. With neither of our children did we ever set a curfew. Never. Never told them what time to be in. What we did tell them, what I often told them was, if you honor the freedom we give you, you'll get more. If you don't honor it, and you show us that you can't be trusted with it, then we'll have to implement stricter guidelines. But if you honor the freedom we give you, if you're respectful, if you show that you're wise enough to handle it, you'll get more. And somehow, by the grace of God, that worked in certain ways. Not in every way. By no means was it perfect. But it worked in some ways. And one of those ways was curfew. They came in at decent hours, reasonable hours. I mean, I'm not talking early hours, but at decent hours. They kept in touch, texted us where they were, and so forth. And so we tried to say to them, make good choices now. You'll get the ability to make more choices along the way. Because we came to believe that that would empower them. And hopefully, it did. Now, on the other hand, there is also the temptation to manipulate. To manipulate them. And after yesterday's meeting, somebody came up to me and talked about rewards. And that can sometimes be a manipulative way to get kids to do what you want them to do. You know, if you'll be home on time, well, I'll give you this, or I'll give you that, or I'll give you the other. I have severe questions about that particular approach. Far better to seek to empower them than to manipulate them, either with praise or with pain. Now, how do you sort through the difference between manipulation and punishment? Manipulation will almost always, maybe not always, but almost always, play somehow on the relational, emotional strings attached. Will often do that. Whereas punishment, remember I said legitimate punishment, you never want to threaten the relationship. You always want to underline the fact that they belong, that they are loved, that they are cherished, that they are nurtured, that there's warmth. That always has to be available. So I think that's a key difference. So, now we come to the last part. I want you to think, back to our model. If you have a contractually based relationship where If you do something, you get something. If you don't do something, you don't get something. Performance is the foundation. And when you disappoint it, bad things happen. Law is broken. Punishment follows. And when change is needed, there's a lot of coercion, a lot of fighting, a lot of arguing, a lot of manipulating. Then the simple reality is this. You can kiss intimacy goodbye. Because people who are in that texture of a relationship have a very hard time opening up to each other. What's the definition of intimacy? A definition of intimacy that I love is that intimacy is the ability to be open with one another without the need to change the other. And that last phrase is very important. Because as soon as you start rearranging the furniture in somebody's house, they're not going to invite you in again. This is my furniture. What are you doing rearranging it? So if you're trying to rearrange who they are, the intimacy gets shut down and people become protective. I don't want somebody trying to change me. So if manipulation is going on, people will become very protective, very defensive. So instead of intimacy, what people end up experiencing is distance. An increasing, growing distance. Remember our two rockets yesterday. At the foundation, when one of them is called covenant, the other one's called contract. They're at ground zero. They look like they're on the same trajectory. But as you continue to follow these out, by the time you get to this point in time, you see the distance, and it's growing. The problem is not going to be fixed just by trying to get those two rockets to be in each other's presence. By the time, for example, a couple has reached this point, if we're using this model as a guide, by the time they've reached this point, just having them spend time together is not going to necessarily fix the problem. It can actually make it worse. If you have a couple who is in a relationship where there's a lot of emotional distance, and now you take them out of their workaday world, their stressful, busy world, and you put them at the beach together for a week with no one else around, it's just the two of them, what becomes even more painfully evident? The distance. That hurts even more. So just putting them together does not always fix the problem. But there is a way to fix it. And the way to fix it is simple, but not easy. Sounds kind of like living life with Jesus, doesn't it? It's simple, but it's not easy. Well, the way to fix this distance, if we can go back to the model, the way to fix the distance is simple but not easy. Because what happens here, could we get the model back up on the screen? What happens here is if you want to move from contract to covenant, you want to move this direction, in other words, you have to answer some simple but difficult questions. And they're questions like these. Am I willing to love this person just as they are? Not trying to change them, but just love them as they are. Am I willing to not make a personal issue out of every moment that we disagree? Not willing to make a federal case out of every disagreement. Am I willing to forgive their flaws without reminding them of how virtuous I am because I'm forgiving them? Am I willing to love them when they aren't lovable? Asking those kinds of questions and answering them by saying yes and living that out will unavoidably move you in covenantal directions. That's what happens with the singles who are dating and who are moving toward marriage, moving from a contractual reality toward a covenantal reality. As their love grows, as their love matures, as they get closer and closer to the wedding altar, they are more and more learning. If that love is maturing and it's a legitimate love, they are learning more and more to say yes to those very kinds of questions. I'm willing to accept him, I'm willing to accept her as they are. Willing to accept this is their family. They're not going to get a new family when we get married. This is who they are. I love them anyway. I'm willing not to try to change them into my own image. I'm willing to accept that this is what life with this individual will be like, and to accept it graciously. As those questions get answered, they are moving from contractual basis of a relationship to a covenantal basis of a relationship. It's the same kind of thing that happens with our kids, with our siblings, with our parents, with our spouses. Can I love them as they are? Accept them as they are? Walk in life with them together as partners, rather than being won over and trying to instruct them of how to live? Am I willing to resist commenting on everything with which I disagree? In other words, am I willing to treat them as I would treat a friend in polite company? We say things and we do things to our spouses and to our families we would never do to our friends. We couldn't do it to our friends because our friends wouldn't stay our friends. They wouldn't take it. And yet we heap that on to each other with the assumption, well, you're married to me, you're my kid, you got to take it. No wonder we end up with that growing distance between us. So, if we want covenantally based relationships, what we end up having to do is to live out the realities of the Christian gospel in our own homes and lives. That gospel that says, I will accept you as you are and love you as you are and forgive you for what you've done. And you know what happens? The Christian gospel, when truly experienced, is transformative. It takes us as we are, but it doesn't leave us as we are. It changes us along the way. And the same will happen to your spouse. The same will happen to your child. The same will happen to you. When you are loved with that kind of love, you don't tend to remain the same. In fact, my degree and my license is in marriage and family therapy. Marriage and family theory says this. If you go to other kinds of psychological schools of thought, be they behavioral or psychodynamic or whatever they are, you can tend to much more focus on the individual. But in family theory, the belief is a family is a system. You cannot change one part of the system without affecting other parts. It will affect other parts. Therefore, if you're the only one who is making the decision to change, take heart. Because if you change, they will have to change in response in some way. It places great power in your hands and in your heart. My hope and my desire is that as we live life together, not just in the body of Christ called the church, but as we live life together as families, that we can grow in ever more covenantal directions. Because if we have the basis of the relationship that is sound, that rocket will take a certain trajectory that will lead to a much healthier family. Let's end with a word of prayer. God of grace, we thank you so much for your goodness, your compassion, your love. Thank you for the covenant you have with us, your family, your people. Let that covenant make such a difference in our own hearts and lives that it will make a difference in the hearts and the lives of every spouse, of every child, of every family in this place. For that I thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. We'll see you tomorrow.